Well, I think you're a sicko.
I could have punched him in the face. I didn't want to come back here. Too many people, and the memories of my previous life were too difficult to bear. Helpless, I watched while he conducted his examination. His fingers trailed over my wall of newspaper articles, crime scene photos, and notes I had connecting the crimes together. His crimes. I looked guilty, obsessed, and if anyone caught me here, they would think it was fact. I stared at a picture of Emma's smiling face, full of life, and I think it was taken during prom, all before I knew what she truly was. I wished I could go back to those days. It all seemed so simple. My life had been a mixture of living on the road and dwelling within his derelict house, while trying to avoid the law. Emma's family had escaped, and my friend would be a lie, and captor too strong a word, never moved far from his residence. His home no longer brought comfort. The small walls felt containing, suffocating, and the dark, dreary walls closed in on me. I felt a pang of shame. He saw my dirty little secret. He tapped his fingers over the photographs of Emma's murder, the bloody mess of the crime scene before rain washed it away. The crime he committed and allowed me to take the blame for. It no longer hurt knowing just what her family were involved in, and made a point to linger there. He gave a wicked grin, chuckling to himself, and shook his head in amused disbelief at my level of dedication to the case. He kept flicking it back and forth, raising his eyebrows, and cleared his throat, then looked through my meager apartment. I avoided people so I wouldn't have to deal with their judgment, and here it was, right in my living room. I stood awkwardly by the front door, my arms crossed, and exhaled. My line's a tight line, and I tried to avoid looking at him.
Well, isn't this a quaint little shithole?
He reached down, rummaging through semi-empty bottles of whiskey, and tried to find one to his taste. With the flesh mask slowly slipping down his face, he ran his fingertip over the coffee table and caught all the dust that lingered there. A finger and thumb rubbed, sending tiny clumps of dust onto the floor. "Why are we here?" I demanded, worried the police would show up at any moment.
One,
He held up a finger.
I want to know what the authorities know about me and if any conspiracy nuts are on my trail.
His middle finger joined the pointer.
2, you might be able to give me some clues for my next target.
And a third one.
3, it's funny to watch you squirm.
He chuckled, made himself at home on the couch, opened up his scribbled notes, and his lips moved while he was reading. The top layer wriggled above, my privacy being invaded, and I dreaded trying to remember what exactly I wrote in there. He stared at me a little too long, smirked, and kept reading, not showing me. "This might be funny for you, but I'm currently being investigated for murder, and I don't want the police to catch me." He opened and closed his hands like a bird talking while I complained when we heard people outside. They were laughing, giggling, and trying to peek inside the windows. I moved closer to the door, out of sight, and watched while he stared irritatedly. A childish, smug smirk appeared on the decayed face. "What the fuck are they doing here?" I insisted through clenched teeth. I tried to peek outside through the curtains without being spotted.
OMG, this is where he used to live. I hear he was a total creep.
Hey, if we can get inside and get a video, it's gonna go viral.
Yes, I can't wait.
I heard them pull and twist the locked doorknob. A blonde with thick eyeliner pressed her face on the window, cupping her hands, and tried to see inside. My host reached up, pulled his face off, and it slithered off his face. The raw meat with pieces of pink exposed bone was an unsettling sight. Pale eyes greeted me through the eye sockets, one I never got used to. "Open the door," he growled, a devilish smirk on his lips, and made his entire body go limp. He sat on the couch, feet on the floor, with his legs spread open and arms resting on either side. He stared up into space with the vague expression of the dead. "What?" I whispered.
I said, open the door, toots.
I reached out, unlocked the door, and opened it a little, allowing it to creak open, hiding in the small space between the door and the wall. The teenagers screamed and burst into giggles. They whispered among themselves, trying to see who had the courage to investigate, and finally, the blonde reached through the open door halfway. She let out a shriek and held her phone out at his seemingly lifeless body, recording what she saw. I could hear her heartbeat, the first time she had known true fear in her life. I stuck to the shadows where I belonged, and once all three were inside, now they were distracted. I eased the door shut and locked it, preventing their escape. They all stood recording him, and I expected him to suddenly jump up, scream, and scare them. Nothing happened. My hand twitches, and I gestured behind them for him to do something. He was still lifeless as a corpse.
Go live on TikTok. Do it.
Hi, my darlings. We are at the home of the suspected killer, and there is a fresh corpse right there.
It stinks in here.
The sound of TikTok alerts trickled in, more viewers arriving to view the display. I figured some would be here for the true crime drama, others to chastise, and some wishing they were here.
Look at the wall.
The flashlight shone on the pictures and newspaper articles. My chest tightened as they kept looking at them and judging, memories flooding back. She stood close, staring at them and wrinkling her face in pure disgust.
Ugh, what a creep.
Must have gotten off on these. Probably sitting in that chair, too. Ew.
It's probably covered in you-know-what.
They burst out in laughter, holding their bodies and trying to keep it inside. I could have sworn I saw him wink. One of the girls picked the discarded face mask and wrinkled her top lip as the foul, gel-like substance clung to her fingertips, clear with traces of pink. It wobbled in her hands as I saw her dry retch, trying to keep her stomach contents inside. He moved slightly, curling a finger when they weren't looking at him, teasing them, turning his wrist to expose his wrist, and for a moment none of them noticed his little game. What frightened me was the police would eventually come home, or my neighbors would be alerted. I didn't want them to get hurt by him, and I debated letting them capture me. Spending time in a jail cell couldn't be as bad as living with whatever he was. Even after all this time, I didn't know his name or where he came from. He was a lingering nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Behind the girl's back, I kept pointing to the door to indicate that I wanted to leave. My gestures grew more intense with the urgency.
Hey, wait. People are saying his arm moved.
You guys, stop messing with us. OMG, we have so many people here.
The two girls leaned close over the phone. I heard more people gathering outside, and I saw his lips quivering, trying to repress a smirk. He moved his hand closer to his leg, and it was now the realization set in for them.
I don't think the internet's working properly anymore.
The blonde said, tapping her screen with her fingernails, frantically trying to get it to work.
We had so many people here.
I think we should leave.
Her friend sobbed, her eyes locked on my acquaintance, backing up until she ran into me. He sat with a cocky, madman's grin, looking from one to another.
Don't bother calling for help. Your phones won't work anymore.
He taunted, looking from one to another, his nose wrinkled in questioning distaste.
I wonder whose face would look best on me.
He asked, looking directly at me, and they turned around, finally noticing me. The three stumbled, unsure where to run, clutching each other, and I hated him even more for drawing attention to me.
That's him. That's the creepy murderer.
Yes, you're right. That's the creepy murderer. I think he wants to kill you.
How were they believing him over me? I folded my arms in agitation, grumbling, while the teenagers crowded in the corner closest to the window. One waved, trying to get the attention of anyone outside, and he stood in the blink of an eye and was by my side.
You didn't answer my question, Precious. Since you're too pretty to connect the dots, whose face should I wear?
Please, don't kill us.
They cried and begged, huddling in the corner and trying to avoid looking at us. I always felt like a pariah, but being treated like a monster was different entirely.
Shut up!
I snapped at him, pointing to them. Each looked terrified. Between their sobs, they pleaded for their lives.
You told me you only killed the guilty. Why would you want to hurt them?
He snorted with raspy laughter. Something rattled inside his chest, and I didn't want to know what it was. They're annoying, they broke in somewhere they don't belong, and something about corrupting the youth. He pointed a finger in the air. It was strangely delicate, even graceful. The rest of his skin was loosening, barely clinging on, and he wiggled his shirt to allow the now rotting skin suit to drop unceremoniously to the ground. The slithering, moist sounds made my skin crawl as it unfurled.
And correction, I said the guilty taste better. I said nothing about only killing the guilty.
I could never hope to understand him. I wasn't immune to the sight nor aroma, and I hated that one day I could be. My shoulders slumped as I exhaled a defeated sigh.
Now, sweetie pie, whose face should I wear?
I couldn't avoid it, looking over at the trio. My gaze moved from one to another and rested on the chosen one. I don't know why I landed on her. None of them particularly stood out. I simply wanted the selection process to be over.
Her,
I answered, numb to ending someone's life.
I choose her.
I saw the eyebrow muscle raise, the whites of his eyes showing more, and he studied my face. I'm not sure what he was searching for. His lips drew back into a cold sneer, and I hated it.
Well, so ready to kill. And, what should we do with the others?
Please, just let us go.
They've seen you, and the police will be chasing that perky peach all the way from here to the mountain trails.
He mused, and I remembered the glowing eyes lurking in the dark forests. His cautious warnings about what else lingered out there troubled me greatly. I imagined the police being led into traps, hands reaching out and dragging them down into the depths of whatever hell lurked out there. He approached the unfortunate one, reaching out with his hand, and his slender frame had surprising strength inside it. He lifted her up by her hair, pulled her close, and she pleaded with him. Crushing her throat with his hand and ignoring her while she lashed out with her fists before they finally dangled by her sides. I didn't see him do it. He ripped off her clothing, discarding it, and used a fingernail claw to slice through her skin. It reminded me of a zipper. I leaned on the wall, sighed, and couldn't avoid staring. The skin was pulled off the meat with precision, no tearing, and wriggled his loose clothing off. He stood naked without a care for his nudity. I couldn't help but look. A thick, clear gel clung to his body, and the foul, pungent aroma hit me in the face. The contents of my stomach rose, clinging to the back of my throat and hovering. I winced as I swallowed. The duo equally stared in petrified awe. I placed his feet inside hers. He placed his feet inside hers, stretching the skin and pulling it up on his legs, making a loud, moist, squeezing sound, connecting it to his skin, becoming part of something. His teeth were clamped shut, muscles taut, and I suspected it caused him pain to complete the grim ritual. I almost felt sorry for him. No matter how he attempted to adjust it, it never sat right on his body and pulled tight in twisted positions. The skin around his neck pulled, and he used both hands to attach the face. The lips were pulled outward, and he massaged them, connecting skin to flesh. His new lips smacked together, bringing feeling to them, and blinked. His face was wider, plumper than his gaunt one, and needed more adjusting. Around his chest and legs, the skin was tight to a point where any movement was awkward. He turned his leg, breaking it and resealing it by pushing it together. I vomited this time and heard an irritated snort from him.
You should be used to it by now, Muffin Cakes.
He stretched his arms in the air. Finally, the flesh subtle enough for his tastes and twisted at the waist. It didn't pull or twist this time. Still, her face on his skull was an uncomfortable illusion, probably worse for her friends. He knelt down, still naked, and took her by the arm, sinking his teeth into it, tearing at the skin and taking a mouthful of it. The loud chewing and tearing sounds always made me wince. He took bite after bite, slicing into the body cavity, and reached inside to pull out her organs. Entrails were lifted, plunged into his mouth, and finally, he broke open her sternum, the highest concentration of bone marrow, breaking the smaller ribs around it, cracked it open, and a loud, slurping sound echoed through the silent room. None of us managed to speak. He cracked her skull open, scooped up the brain, the fatty structure, and held it up to me, offering me some. When I didn't respond immediately, he shook his head with some dribbling from the side of his lip. I stared at him, dumbfounded, and he insisted more firmly this time. No! He put his hands up, like I didn't know what I was missing, shrugged, and kept eating, gorging himself and his stomach inside her flesh suit, bloated. Now complete, he stood, his face and body coated in blood. His mouth went to each finger, going from tip to knuckle easily, and sucked off the juices.
Nearly done, lollipops. Soon I'll be ready.
The boy and girl were hugging each other, letting out muffled sobs, and avoided speaking to each other. I hated thinking about how high their therapy bill will be after this.
Well, Sparky, I've always wanted to be a blonde.
He responded, fixing his hair, and I couldn't help but look at the mangled remains of the girl. She didn't deserve this. Few people, if anyone, did. He got up, reaching out for a mixture of his old and her clothing, still leaving his feet bare, and walked through the blood and gore, allowing it to squeeze through his toes. I didn't want to bring attention to the surviving pair, but...
What should we do about them?
I asked, while he was half out the door. His hand rested on the doorframe, diagonally looking outside, and shrugged.
Up to you. Will you risk being seen? Will you murder? Should I get my popcorn?
He giddily clapped his hands together. I heard some of my neighbors opening their doors, and I pushed him outside, locking and slamming it behind me.
Let's go. We shouldn't have come back here.
I snapped, irritably walking to the car, and stood by the passenger seat. The old station wagon needed a key to open, so I stood impatiently. I tapped the door while he dawdled across the parking lot and still stretched. He opened the car door, easing himself inside, and readjusted the seat while I glared at him through the window. I knocked it a couple of times. He started the car and rolled his eyes to unlock it. I opened it and sat inside, hoping to drive away before he decided to do something else.
I don't know why you're like this. You wanted to leave the cabin, get out of the house, and now you're complaining,
he said, suddenly driving backwards and hitting one of the bins, spilling the contents on the road. We drove off, and I saw one of my elderly neighbor's doors open. His muffled voice in the distance and raised cane suggested he wasn't happy with us. I looked back through the rear window, despite the view being partially concealed with dirt, and noticed all the neighbors coming out of their houses. Why now? Not before, when they were screaming. They might have wanted to remain safe, and given the crime, formerly caused by us, in the area, it made sense. I gave him a questioning look, but he ignored me, focusing on the road. By now it was nighttime, and occasionally the flare of another light caused his eyes to glow. Where were all the teenagers who were showing up to gawk where the live stream was taking place? He drove past the main park, a place where the popular kids from high school would loiter and make a nuisance of themselves. I was never welcome there. Crowds of teenagers stood with their hands in their pockets, staring at the ground, motionless and confused. Motionless and confused ambulance personnel stood around them. There had to be at least 50 of them, all standing in a circle and unresponsive. People were shaking them, waving their hands in their faces and trying to get their attention. Nothing worked.
What's wrong with them?
I asked in wonder. One of the paramedics looked so familiar, and now it looked like her mother was dealing with a case. Come to think of it, people aged more than I previously thought. A fleeting memory of a town that I used to watch rather than be a part of. Even then, I was an outcast, all adding to how this no longer felt like home.
I think we need to talk about you obsessing over random trollops whose families are involved in human trafficking.
His voice was the same, inside his victim's skin, and pointed a finger at me. In the limited light, the skin was peeling off at the edges and leaving sagging marks.
That wall was disturbing. Hate to think of what you hide. I could imagine you standing there, looking at the wall, obsessing and hoping to become the town's savior while fondling yourself.
Shut up, I mumbled under my breath. I recalled the memory of glaring at the wall, believing that I would save the town and finally be given the respect I deserved. Sure, Emma, the focus of my desire, wouldn't be mine, but at least I'd be treated better. I frowned, looking out my window at the quiet town. The new construction was changing it. Modern buildings sprang up and broke the appeal. It had been profitable for the wrongdoers. People were moving out as it became too expensive to live here. Older homes bulldozed to make way for tiny, ugly boxes. It happened everywhere, all except the wild mountain range that he called home. We drove through the unkempt roads. He naturally didn't slow down and wasn't worried by the uneven surfaces nor the many potholes. I could see eyes staring at me from the roadside. Some blinked and were clearly animals, while others had shadowy humanoid outlines, and they never blinked. They'd creep forward while we drove by, and their gaze would linger until we left.
We should have grabbed food while we were in town,
I complained, over time eating decaying roadkill and opening up cans of food from the 1950s. Most of them weren't bad, just bland and on the verge of tastelessness.
Yada yada yada, always has something to whine about,
he answered, doing that same sarcastic motion with his hand. Ever since he saw a child do it, he had been mimicking him. I leaned on the doorframe, resting my hand on my chin, and considered my time with him. He was still being elusive about his identity, and wouldn't openly tell me. I thought he would have told me. We sat in silence. The journey couldn't have been that long, and yet the road felt endless. All I could hear was the loud, tortured sound of the engine and an occasional raspy breath. Questions only ever led to more.
What are the things by the side of the road?
He gave me a sideward glance, ignoring the road and steering on instinct. I wasn't bothered by the possibility of us spinning off and hitting a tree.
You've asked this before. Why do you ask again?
His tone was surprisingly serious. The flesh was losing its grip on his skin, falling off and making him sad. It hung at the jowls, flopping around, and that same odor lingered. I stopped asking him long ago why some were easier to wear than others. I shrugged, indifferent, and picked at my cuticles, and focused on the headlights in front of me. I felt the skin rip away, and went to keep going. His hand took my wrist to stop me.
You're bleeding.
There was no remark or taunt. I looked down to see my cuticles torn open up to the first knuckle. I didn't even notice it hurt. I could see the outline of my bone, pink from moisture, nestled in between pink flesh that had a green tinge. Lifting it from my knee, holding it close to my face, and resting it on my leg again.
What's happening to me?
I muttered. He leaned forward, putting both hands on the wheel, fingers crudely tapping, then let out an irritated grumble, pulling off the face skin mask, and tore it so it curled around him like a morbid onesie. My companion grinned at me.
Nothing,
he insisted, too quickly, and finally added in his usual tone.
Nothing. You'll be fine.
I noticed in my peripheral vision his smile drop. We didn't have far to go until we returned to the shambled, abandoned house that had become home. He parked in the overgrown driveway, and dawn was fast approaching with the rising sun. The car door creaked when it opened. I stepped out and saw the eyes in the tree line. Some were high, blinking owls or other birds, while others were the same height as a human, and I expected to feel fear. I developed an uncharacteristic apathy, a haze unwilling to fade. He hadn't gotten out of the car yet. I walked up the questionably unstable wooden stairs, opened the door that clung onto life, and squealed when it opened. It slammed behind me before I was back in my hovel. I opened the fridge to grab a can of pop before I sat on the couch that had once served as my prison. I heard shouting outside, my captor screaming at something that growled in response, and I heard a loud thud on the ground. I wasn't going to rescue him, so I walked to the old stained curtain, parted it, and wiped it with my hand to rid it of the dirt. He lay on his back with a large, black-haired beast standing above him. It had long, muscular arms with large, powerful hands and roared up at the heavens. Fierce, black teeth bared. Its head resembled both a wolf's and a bear's and stood over 7 feet tall. For the first time, I saw him vulnerable and remembered his fateful words from when I was brought here against my will. You will make it very far. There are things in the dark that even I'm afraid of. This had to be it. He was on his back, arms limp by his sides and winded from the strike. His skinless face stared up at his adversary, and he lifted his head, skin pulled in the corner in surrender. I opened the can with a loud pop, then a hiss, took a sip, and continued to observe the display. The sound alerted the creature to stare in my direction. I dropped the can on the floor, flitting the contents on the floor, and I had no time to look down. It appeared centimeters away from the window, having those bare teeth with a trail of drool dripping from its lips. I sniveled, eyes wide, and didn't know what to do. Frozen, foolishly, I noticed it didn't try to break inside the abandoned house, even though he surely could have damaged the wood paneling or broken the glass to reach me. It arched its back and let out a loud, monstrous yelp. It disappeared, and I tried to find it. Uneasy, knowing how fast it could move, and once I found it at the tree line, I breathed a sigh of relief. He crudely kicked open the door, strode inside, and walked to the kitchen, opening up all the cupboards. Most of them were still bare, and he grumbled under his breath.
What was that?
He ignored me.
Who was that?
He still ignored me. Leaning down to the bottom cupboard, his hand reached in and pulled out a wooden box. Black wax coated the top, and he broke the wax seal. Gray smoke flowed out the edges, and he threw it onto the floor. It cracked and burst open, spilling the gray dust. A locket of hair had a rolled-up scroll. He gave me a triumphant grin, hands raised on either side, and I expected a demon or djinn to reveal itself. Nothing happened.
What's supposed to happen?
I asked, irritably.
Well, bold all of a sudden, aren't we? Mr. Gawk's at the window.
He snapped, and I couldn't help but feel embarrassed. I could have gone out there to help him.
We'll be spending the night talking to dear old Mom. A rather pleasant and...
He paused, swaying his hand, debating on the correct term to use.
Well, come to think of it, she wasn't exactly pleasant.
He grabbed my shoulder, pulled me close.
She's quite horrible. Don't say anything. She can hear you.
I didn't think it was possible for this to get weird.
What was that thing?
I asked through clenched teeth.
Neighbor, and he will be back come nightfall. Hence why Mother Dearest will be joining us.
He walked to the lounge room, lifted up the couch, and tilted his head back and forth, seemingly looking for something. What was revealed beneath among the dust, old animal droppings and a stray mouse carcass, were old wooden toys. They had to be from before the 1950s, at least, and he lowered it to the floor.
I shouldn't have taken this damned meat suit. I didn't know I'd be in battle.
He grumbled to himself, tapping the floorboards with his foot, and kept moving to check different areas.
But why is he angry with you?
We may have killed a family member of his and violated a treaty that was held in place by virtue for 200 years, risking our lives and those of all the humans around us.
He flicked his hand dismissively. I blinked.
What?
Yeah, no big deal.
The murders, or executions, had become part of my normal life. I used to ask what the person did, and other than the teenage girl earlier, I'd assumed they were all guilty one way or another. I didn't directly participate, yet he had roped me into this lifestyle of his.
And what will happen?
He sighed, arching backward, and exhaled in frustration at the question.
They're going to waltz over, bring a wicker picnic basket, and come give us a sweet little kiss, sunshine,
he said. His flesh, the exposed muscle, now appeared damaged, strained. My gaze dropped to his cheek. With a snort, he noticed my attention on it and turned away.
What do you think? They're gonna come kill us if they can. Now, Some safety tips, unless I tell you. Don't leave the cabin. They can't come inside. And 2, don't believe what they tell you. They lie. I couldn't resist an irritated snort in response. He had told many lies himself. I need a new face. Something doesn't feel right. He winced, pulling the skin from his body and allowing it to fall on the floor in a clump. His body, tense, hunched over, and I could tell he was in considerable pain. Why? I'm not sure. Perhaps her skin didn't match up with his. He growled, looked in my direction. Stay here. I'll be back soon. Don't go out, and more importantly, don't listen if you hear your name. Why? He walked to the door, opened it, and allowed it to slam behind him. Again, I was left alone. I wondered who the next victim would be, and what horrid crime they had committed.
Jeffrey.
I heard my name, one I hadn't heard for years, and I barely recognized it. The voice was gravelly, different to my host's, and yet had a distinct tinge, as though speaking in this way was foreign.
I know you can hear me, Jeffrey.
I saw a shadow at the window. The giant wolf being had returned and stood in place. I took another mouthful of my drink, swirling it around in my mouth, all I could do while I waited for my host.
I can help you escape.
I scoffed. I'd forever be in a limbo, unable to return to my old life.
Just open the door for me. You don't have to be involved.
No. Its shoulders slumped, and I wondered if it was sad or disappointed by my lack of compliance.
Then you die tonight.
It disappeared. The morning sun still entered through the broken window, and figured I'd make myself useful. I stood up, went down into the cluttered basement filled with a variety of boxes, rotting furniture, and random pieces. I picked up a jar of rusty nails and old planks of wood and took them up to start boarding up the open window. I didn't know whether I wanted to help or if I needed to keep my mind busy. I could, in theory, leave and follow the road to take it back to town. However, whatever it was likely still lingered around the property. My host, whatever his name was, had grown on me, as much as he sickened me. I couldn't see anyone while I worked, yet the feeling of being watched remained. Feelings that someone was speaking to me were relentless. I gripped my hat, continuing to board up the windows when I heard the rusty car return and the headlights light up the dim driveway. I heard the car door open, and he burst to the door. He wore a young man's skin, his hand clutched his side, blood and gore leaking through. He groaned, his breaths each raspy gasps, and I hurried over to him, putting his arm around my shoulder and leading him toward the couch. What happened? I was shot. In all this time, I never thought that he could be injured or possibly killed. I put my hand on it to try to stop the bleeding.
I'll have time to get another.
I couldn't understand the growls muttered from his lips. It felt warm, and I let out a wretched squeal when I felt my hands tingling, then burning. A sizzling sound and smoke drifted upward when he pushed my hand away. My skin had begun to melt, and I stared at the exposed bone, terrified, and he gave me that cocky smirk of his. Welcome to the family, darling.
Thank you for listening and delving with me into the dark together.
Please remember to leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you feel so inclined. The more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will push my content to others.
Thus, the following will grow.
All stories read in this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, and just about everywhere else. Links in the description.
Thank you for listening and feeding the cause. We'll be seeing you